It was December 1943, and the Pacific Ocean burned like a sea of molten fire. Every sunrise brought the echo of gunfire, and every night, the restless hum of engines filled the dark horizon. The United States had been fighting across thousands of miles of ocean, from the coral atolls of Tarawa to the jungles of New Guinea. But in the middle of this brutal campaign, something unexpected, something profoundly human, would soon take place. The American flag fluttered over a newly secured island outpost. The battle had ended only days ago. The sand was still blackened with gunpowder, the air heavy with the smell of oil and salt. U.S. Marines, their faces tired but resolute, were now doing something that no one had expected in this theater of war, tending to wounded Japanese prisoners of war. These were men who, until just days before, had fought with fanatical devotion to their emperor. They had been told that Americans were monsters, cruel, merciless, and without honor. Japanese propaganda painted U.S. troops as devils in human skin. To surrender was unthinkable. To fall into American hands was, in their minds, a fate worse than death. But when the fighting stopped, reality proved to be far different. At dawn, as the sun climbed over the Pacific, a group of American medics began their rounds. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a young medic from Kansas, carried his supply bag across the sandy clearing that had once been a battlefield. His orders were simple: treat the wounded, no matter the uniform they wore. That was the American way. When Hayes reached the makeshift medical tent, he found a group of Japanese POWs sitting quietly under guard. They were thin, sunburned, and trembling, not from the cold but from fear. They expected punishment. They expected cruelty. Instead, they saw something they could not understand. American nurses, women who could have been their sisters, wives, or daughters back home, were tending to them. One of them, Corporal Mary Ellison, offered a cup of tea to a wounded Japanese soldier. Her voice was gentle, her smile kind. The man hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. But when he finally accepted it, tears filled his eyes. He bowed his head, unable to speak. For the first time in his life he saw his enemy's humanity. And for the Americans, this moment wasn't just about compassion. It was a statement of values. The United States was fighting not only to win a war, but to defend what it meant to be civilized, to show that even in chaos, honor and mercy must never die. The scene repeated itself across the Pacific. After every hard-won battle, from Guadalcanal to the Gilbert Islands, American medics and nurses treated Japanese prisoners with the same care they gave their own men. They shared food, bandaged wounds, and sometimes even prayed beside them. It shocked the prisoners. Many wept silently. Some refused to eat at first, fearing poison. But when they realized the Americans meant no harm, something inside them began to change. They had been told Americans had no soul, yet here they were, showing more mercy than they had ever imagined possible. That was the power of the United States Army, not just its strength but its heart. Interesting fact. By late 1943, U.S. forces had captured thousands of Japanese soldiers for the first time in the Pacific Campaign. Despite propaganda that portrayed the Japanese as unwilling to surrender, American officers were astonished to discover how many POWs begged for mercy once they realized they would be treated humanely. For many of these prisoners, their first taste of American compassion came in the form of something simple: a smile, a cup of tea, or a helping hand. And so, in the heart of war, the U.S. Army proved that victory was not only measured in battles won, but in humanity preserved. What began as an act of duty soon became a story of redemption, one that would echo across the Pacific and reshape the hearts of men on both sides. Because sometimes the greatest victories are not won with bullets, but with kindness. The Pacific sun blazed high in the sky as the convoy began to move. It was December 18, 1943, 5 days after the island had fallen quiet. The thunder of guns had been replaced by the soft hum of truck engines and the rhythmic crunch of boots on sand. For the first time in weeks, there was no gunfire, only the cries of seabirds and the distant sound of waves. The Americans were escorting dozens of Japanese prisoners of war from the captured battlefield to a rear encampment for medical care and processing. Among the soldiers leading the march was Sergeant William "Bill" Carter, a decorated Marine who had fought through Guadalcanal and Tarawa. He had seen the horrors of war up close: comrades lost, enemies who refused to surrender, and battles where mercy was a luxury. Yet, as he watched the wounded Japanese hobble along beside him, his sense of duty outweighed any desire for vengeance. "They're soldiers just like us," Carter told one of his men. "They fought for what they believed in. But we're Americans. We do things differently." That spirit, the American spirit, guided every step of that march. The prisoners, still wary, walked in silence. Some limped, leaning on makeshift crutches. Others stared at the ground, expecting blows that never came. The guards didn't shout. They didn't mock. Instead, they offered canteens of water, sometimes even sharing their rations. One prisoner collapsed from exhaustion. Without hesitation, Private James Turner, a 19-year-old from Oklahoma, rushed forward to help him up. The Japanese soldier recoiled in fear, expecting the butt of a rifle. But Turner simply smiled, handed him his water bottle and said softly, "You're okay, buddy. Keep walking. You'll be fine." That moment, witnessed by both Americans and prisoners, became something none of them would forget. To the Japanese soldiers, such kindness was unimaginable. They had been trained to believe that surrender meant dishonor, and that Americans treated captives worse than animals. Their officers had told them stories of brutality, of torture, of enemies without compassion. But the truth they were now living shattered everything they had been taught. As the convoy reached the coastline, the prisoners were loaded onto landing craft bound for a larger American base. The nurses and medics stood by, ready to receive them. Corporal Mary Ellison, who had earlier offered tea to one of the wounded men, watched as they disembarked. Some bowed weakly in gratitude, an unthinkable gesture from Japanese soldiers just a week ago. Inside the medical tents, American doctors examined each prisoner carefully. They treated burns, bullet wounds, and infections. They changed bandages with precision and care. For the nurses, it was exhausting work. The tropical heat, the endless stream of casualties, and the emotional weight of tending to former enemies. Yet not one of them complained. To them, mercy was not weakness. It was a mark of strength, the kind that only true discipline could create. Interesting fact. According to U.S. military records, American field hospitals in the Pacific treated thousands of Japanese POWs with the same medical standards used for their own soldiers. This practice was rooted in the Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States honored even when many of its enemies did not. For the Japanese prisoners, this adherence to international law was shocking. They had expected humiliation. Instead, they received dignity. As night fell, the camp grew quiet. The Japanese prisoners lay on clean cots, their wounds bandaged, their bellies full for the first time in weeks. Outside, the American guards sat around small fires, cleaning their rifles and writing letters home. Sergeant Carter looked toward the tents and said quietly to his men, "You see that? That's why we fight. Not just to win, but to show the world who we are." In that moment, under the dim Pacific moonlight, the true power of the U.S. Army revealed itself, not only in its weapons but in its character. These young men and women, far from home and surrounded by the ghosts of battle, chose compassion over cruelty. They showed that victory wasn't just about conquering enemies, it was about conquering hatred itself. And in those small acts of mercy, America planted a seed, one that would one day grow into something far greater than any battlefield triumph. Because the strongest armies in history are not those that destroy, they are the ones that choose to heal. It was December 23, 1943. The Pacific winds had shifted, carrying with them the faint scent of pine and salt. On a remote corner of a captured island stood a newly established American prisoner of war camp, a small cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and the endless blue of the ocean. The sign at the entrance read simply, U.S. Army, Pacific Detention Facility 47. For most who passed through its gates, it wasn't a place of punishment, it was a place of awakening. When the first group of Japanese prisoners arrived, they were trembling with exhaustion. Their eyes darted nervously at every uniform, every weapon, every order barked in English. They expected humiliation, beatings, perhaps even death. Yet what they found inside those gates was something far different. Colonel James Harland, the commanding officer of the camp, was a man known for his discipline and integrity. A veteran of the Philippines campaign, Harland had seen the worst of the enemy's brutality, but he had also seen the best of American virtue. Standing before his men on that first day, he made one thing clear. "These prisoners are under our protection," he said firmly. "They are not our enemies anymore. They are our responsibility. The United States Army does not fight like savages. We fight with honor." And under his command, honor became law. Each prisoner was registered, examined, and given food and water. Their tattered uniforms were replaced with clean khaki garments marked POW. They were assigned sleeping quarters, and for the first time in months, they lay on real bedding instead of mud or sand. To the American soldiers, it was a matter of principle. To the Japanese, it was a miracle. Private Yamato Nishida, a former imperial soldier, later recalled, "We thought they would beat us or starve us. Instead, they gave us rice, medicine, and blankets. I could not understand why. I thought maybe they wanted to trick us. But the kindness never stopped. Every morning, the American guards stood at attention as the camp flag was raised, the stars and stripes glimmering under the tropical sun. For the POWs, that flag, once feared, now symbolized something entirely new: discipline, fairness, and a strange sense of safety. Inside the camp, daily routines mirrored the order and structure that defined the U.S. military itself. Meals were served 3 times a day. Work details were organized, not as punishment but as a way to keep the prisoners active and mentally strong. American doctors held regular health inspections. Chaplains visited the wounded, sometimes reading scripture in slow, careful English, their voices calm and steady. Interesting fact: historical reports from the U.S. War Department confirmed that American-run POW camps in the Pacific maintained some of the highest humanitarian standards of any wartime detention centers. In contrast to Axis practices, U.S. facilities often allowed prisoners to write letters, practice their religion, and even attend language or educational classes. Back at Camp 47, those same principles were taking root. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, a group of American soldiers set up a makeshift stage near the mess hall. With guitars and harmonicas borrowed from supply crates, they began to play soft tunes, old American folk songs, the kind that spoke of home, of fields and rivers, of peace. The Japanese prisoners watched in silence at first. Then one by one they began to smile. Some even clapped, shyly at first, then louder. In that simple exchange, music between enemies, barriers began to crumble. For the Americans, this was more than mercy. It was proof of what they were fighting for. In a world drowning in brutality, they were the example that civilization could endure. Sergeant Bill Carter, the same Marine who had led the march days earlier, watched the scene from the sidelines. He turned to one of his men and said, "You see that? That's the difference between us and them. They fight for an emperor. We fight for humanity." That night, as the camp settled under a blanket of stars, the Japanese POWs lay awake, not from fear but from confusion. Everything they had believed about their enemy was unraveling. The faces they once imagined as monsters were now those of men, kind, disciplined, and merciful. And deep inside, a quiet realization began to form. The United States was not just winning the war of weapons, it was winning the war of values. Through every small act of respect, every gesture of compassion, the U.S. Army was proving something timeless: that even amid the ashes of conflict, America's greatest weapon was not its firepower, but its decency. It was December 29, 1943, and the winds over the Pacific had softened. The nights were cooler now, the stars sharp against the velvet black sky. Inside Camp 47, life was beginning to take a new rhythm, one shaped not by fear but by discipline and purpose. What began as a simple prisoner camp was slowly turning into something no one had imagined: a place of learning, understanding, and redemption. Colonel James Harlan had a vision. To him, victory was more than defeating an army, it was enlightening a generation. "If we can show them who we truly are," he told his staff officers one morning, "then we win more than a war. We win their respect. And that'll echo long after the guns fall silent." So, under his direction, the Americans began something remarkable. Every morning, after roll call, the Japanese prisoners were assembled near the open courtyard. They stood in neat rows, silent, still cautious. But instead of receiving orders for hard labor or punishment, they were met with chalkboards, notebooks, and an interpreter. The Americans had created a classroom inside a POW camp. Major Thomas Whitaker, a history teacher from Ohio before the war, volunteered to lead the first session. His topic was simple: the United States of America, land of freedom. Through interpreters and crude sketches on a board, he explained ideas that were alien to most of the men before him: the concept of liberty, individual rights, the power of democracy. He spoke of how Americans were not ruled by a single man, but by laws written by the people themselves. The Japanese soldiers listened, silent and wide-eyed. They had grown up worshipping an emperor as divine. To hear of a nation where leaders could be questioned, where ordinary men could shape their own future, was something they had never imagined possible. "Freedom," Whitaker said, pointing to the word written in chalk, "is not weakness. It is strength. Because when men are free, they stand taller. They fight not out of fear but out of choice." That sentence lingered in the air long after the class ended. Over the following weeks, the Americans expanded their lessons. There were English language classes, basic math, and even moral instruction from the camp chaplain. They showed films, American propaganda reels, yes, but also stories of home, of everyday life in towns and cities untouched by war. The POWs watched in stunned silence as the screen flickered with images of American families laughing at dinner tables, children playing baseball, women working in factories. It was a world that felt impossibly distant, yet deeply human. Interesting fact. During World War II, several U.S. POW camps in both the Pacific and mainland America implemented re-education programs aimed at teaching democratic values to captured Axis soldiers. Historians later credited these programs for helping thousands of POWs return home with changed beliefs, many of whom would later become advocates for peace and U.S.Japan friendship. Inside Camp 47, the same transformation was beginning to take hold. Private Yamato Nishida, the same soldier who once trembled in fear of his captors, now spent hours practicing English words under the dim light of a lantern. "Thank you," he repeated softly, his accent thick but sincere. "Thank you, America." The guards too were changing. Many of them, hardened by months of combat, began to see the prisoners not as enemies, but as men caught in the same storm. They shared cigarettes, traded stories, even laughed together on quiet evenings. One night, as the camp's generator buzzed softly and the air smelled faintly of coffee and sea salt, Sergeant Bill Carter sat by the fence with a Japanese POW who had once been a sergeant himself. Through broken English and gestures they spoke of families, of home, of peace. When Carter stood to leave, the Japanese soldiers saluted him, not out of obligation but respect. Moments like that were the invisible victories, the kind that never made headlines but defined the American legacy. Because even behind barbed wire, even in the heart of war, the United States Army carried with it something unbreakable, the belief that knowledge, compassion, and discipline could turn even enemies into men of conscience. By New Year's Eve, 1943, Camp 47 had become more than a detention center. It was a testament to America's higher calling, that true strength lies not in domination, but in the courage to teach mercy where others would sow hatred. And as fireworks flashed faintly over the faraway ships in the harbor, one thing became clear. The American soldiers were not just guarding prisoners. They were guarding the very idea of what America stood for. It was December 24, 1943. The Pacific sky shimmered with 1,000 stars, and a soft breeze carried the scent of sea salt through the palm trees that surrounded Camp 47. For the first time since the fighting had ended, the camp was calm. The hum of the generator blended with the faint laughter of soldiers setting up tables near the mess hall. But this wasn't for a meeting or a briefing or another lecture. This was Christmas Eve. And for the men and women of the United States Army, even on a distant island half a world away, Christmas was sacred, not just for its faith but for what it symbolized: peace, goodwill, and hope. Inside the camp kitchen, American cooks worked through the night. The aroma of roasted ham, cornbread, and cocoa drifted across the compound. It was the closest thing to home anyone had smelled in months. Nearby, nurses and medics strung up makeshift decorations: small paper stars, strings of shell beads, and even a tree crafted from driftwood and scraps of green cloth. Colonel James Harlan had given a simple order earlier that day. Tomorrow no one goes hungry, not our men, not our prisoners. And so, for the first time since their capture, the Japanese POWs found themselves invited, not commanded, not ordered, but invited to share in the Christmas meal. At dawn, the prisoners lined up nervously outside the mess tent. Many still couldn't believe what was happening. Some whispered that it was a trick. Others bowed their heads, uncertain how to react to the laughter and music coming from inside. But when they entered, they saw something that stopped them cold. American soldiers, the same men who had fought them in battle, were smiling, shaking hands, and offering plates of food. A young nurse poured hot cocoa for a group of thin, weary prisoners. A soldier handed out small biscuits wrapped in napkins. And in the corner, a gramophone played Silent Night. Private Yamato Nishida sat quietly at the table, hands trembling as he lifted his spoon. Across from him sat Sergeant Bill Carter, who nodded and raised his tin mug in a silent toast. "Merry Christmas," Carter said gently. Nishida didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. He smiled faintly and bowed his head. That moment, simple, wordless, human, became the soul of Camp 47. Interesting fact. Across many American-held POW camps during World War II, Christmas and New Year's were often celebrated with shared meals and symbolic gestures of peace. Declassified records later revealed that U.S. military policy encouraged humane observances, believing that moral strength was a vital part of America's image both abroad and at home. As the day went on, the boundaries between guard and prisoner seemed to fade. The Americans played guitars, singing folk tunes and carols. Some of the Japanese prisoners, uncertain at first, began to hum along. One even tapped the rhythm softly against his metal cup. Nurses moved between tables, refilling plates and smiling. For them, this was more than duty, it was a reminder of home, of brothers and fathers fighting far away, and of the reason they had come here, to serve something greater than themselves. Later that evening, Colonel Harlan gave a short address to his men. His voice was steady, carrying across the warm Pacific air. "Tonight," he said, "we prove that the strength of America is not just in her armies but in her spirit. We show the world that mercy is not weakness, it's courage. Remember this day because when history writes about us, let it say that even in war, we never forgot what it meant to be human." The camp fell silent. Even the prisoners listened. That night, the Americans and the Japanese lay under the same sky. For the first time in many of their lives, the prisoners felt no fear. They were warm, full, and surrounded by men who treated them not as beasts but as equals. In one of the barracks, a Japanese soldier whispered to his friend, "They are not devils. They are kind." And outside, Sergeant Carter looked up at the stars, the same ones that hung over his home in Kansas, and thought to himself that maybe, just maybe, this was what victory really looked like. Because that night, on a forgotten island in the Pacific, the United States of America didn't just win a war of nations. It won a war of hearts. By the time the calendar turned to January 1, 1944, a new kind of peace had settled over Camp 47, a peace born not from treaties or surrenders, but from compassion. And though the battles still raged across the Pacific, the men at Camp 47 knew one truth that would stay with them forever. Even in the darkest corners of the world, America could still bring light. It was January 5, 1944, and the Pacific mornings had grown cooler. The first light of dawn spilled over the rows of barracks at Camp 47, casting long golden shadows over the American guards making their rounds. The air was quiet, broken only by the sound of waves crashing beyond the wire and the distant cries of seabirds. But inside the camp, something extraordinary was happening, a quiet transformation, one born not of orders or threats but of respect. The Japanese prisoners, who weeks earlier had refused to make eye contact with their captors, now greeted the Americans with cautious nods. Some even attempted small English words they had learned in class. "Good morning, thank you, yes, sir." For the men of the U.S. Army hardened by months of brutal combat, these gestures meant more than medals or commendations ever could. It was proof that their discipline, their compassion, and their unwavering code of conduct were winning a battle that no bullet could ever achieve, the battle for human dignity. Colonel James Harlan, watching from his office window, noted the change in his daily report. "POWs are showing signs of trust," he wrote. "Discipline and humane treatment continue to yield positive results. Morale among American personnel remains high." Under Harlan's leadership, the camp ran like a machine, efficient, orderly, and guided by one unshakable principle: we are Americans and we do what's right. Each morning began with roll call, followed by breakfast, rice and soup for the POWs, bacon and coffee for the guards. Then came work details. But unlike the cruel labor imposed in enemy camps, here the tasks had purpose and dignity. Some prisoners helped repair fences. Others assisted medics or worked in the kitchen. A few were even trained as orderlies, serving in the camp hospital where they tended to both American and Japanese wounded. One afternoon, Private Yamato Nishida, once terrified of his American captors, volunteered to sweep the infirmary floor. When a nurse dropped a tray of bandages, Nishida knelt to help her gather them. She smiled and said, "Arigato." He froze in surprise, then smiled back. It was the first time he had ever heard an American speak his language. Moments like that began to ripple through the camp. The prisoners were no longer just captives. They were men learning, through example, that the strength of the United States was not in cruelty or fear, but in discipline, fairness, and heart. Interesting fact. Historical archives show that by early 1944, American-run POW camps reported a dramatic decline in escape attempts and disciplinary issues. Analysts credited this to the humane and structured approach of U.S. Army officers, who prioritized respect over repression. Many Japanese POWs even began volunteering for camp duties as a gesture of gratitude. At Camp 47, those changes were visible everywhere. The barracks that had once echoed with silence were now filled with quiet chatter. The POWs cleaned their quarters with pride. They began organizing small study groups, helping each other learn English words and basic American customs. To the guards, it was astonishing. To the officers, it was validation of everything they stood for. Sergeant Bill Carter, whose steady leadership had earned respect from both sides, watched a group of prisoners repair a broken water line under the hot sun. He turned to one of his men and said, "You see that? That's what happens when you treat a man right. You don't break him, you build him." That evening, as the flag was lowered and taps played softly over the camp, Colonel Harlan gathered his officers for a briefing. They spoke not of tactics or maps but of purpose. "This," Harlan said, gesturing toward the camp outside, "is why we're different. Anyone can fight. But it takes real courage to stay human when the world goes mad." Outside, the Japanese prisoners stood in formation, watching silently as the American flag came down. For the first time, many bowed their heads, not in surrender but in respect. They had begun to understand something profound. The Americans didn't just have stronger weapons. They had stronger hearts. And as the days passed, that understanding spread quietly from man to man, melting away the lies of wartime propaganda. The enemy they had feared, the so-called monsters of American legend, were, in truth, men of honor. And that realization would change them forever. Because in that camp, on that faraway island in 1944, the United States Army was proving that the greatest power in history is not domination, it is moral strength. Even behind barbed wire, America's example shone brighter than any victory banner. And for the prisoners who witnessed it, that light would stay with them long after the war was over. It was January 14, 1944. The Pacific sun rose slowly, its golden light washing over Camp 47. The waves beat gently against the island's shore, and the flag of the United States rippled proudly in the wind. Inside the camp, life had found rhythm. The prisoners worked with quiet purpose, the guards carried out their duties with discipline, and for the first time in months, there was an atmosphere of peace, fragile but real. But outside the barbed wire, the story of what was happening here was beginning to travel. A transport officer named Captain Robert Mason arrived from the mainland with fresh supplies and a stack of official dispatches. He expected to find the usual, weary guards, tense prisoners, and the lingering bitterness of war. What he found instead left him speechless. He saw American soldiers chatting casually with POWs. He saw Japanese men repairing fences and sweeping walkways under the supervision of guards who spoke to them, not as masters but as men. And at the heart of it all, he saw a small group of prisoners standing in formation, singing a quiet song in their language. "What in God's name have you done here, Colonel?" Mason asked later that evening, half in awe. Colonel James Harlan smiled. "We just remembered who we are," he said. "We're Americans." That night, Mason filed his report to the Pacific Command. Camp 47 displays an exceptional example of discipline, efficiency, and moral conduct. Prisoners show respect and cooperation. Recommend this model be studied for other Pacific POW operations. That report would soon reach General Douglas MacArthur's staff, where it sparked discussions about the strategic value of humane treatment. Because the Americans weren't just fighting with weapons, they were fighting for ideas. And in the global theater of war, ideas were powerful. Interesting fact. Declassified records later revealed that intelligence officers in Tokyo had intercepted fragments of prisoner letters sent from American camps. The letters described kindness, medical care, and fair treatment, directly contradicting the Japanese government's portrayal of Americans as barbarians. These reports caused confusion and even quiet disbelief among high command officials. Meanwhile, in Camp 47, those same letters were being carefully censored, stamped, and shipped by the U.S. Army Postal Corps. The POWs wrote to their families back home, telling them things like, "We are treated fairly. We are fed. Americans are not as we were told." Those words, small as they were, carried enormous power. They began to erode the foundation of hate that had fueled years of propaganda. Back in the camp, daily life continued with quiet dignity. The Americans kept order not through fear but through respect. Sergeant Bill Carter, now seen by many prisoners as a figure of authority and fairness, often reminded his men, "Every action we take here says something about the country we represent. The world's watching even when we think it's not." He was right. In February 1944, reports from multiple Pacific islands began mentioning the same thing: Japanese prisoners surrendering more willingly, their fear replaced by curiosity. Some even approached American lines waving white cloths, shouting broken English phrases like, "No kill. America kind." That change began here in places like Camp 47. American compassion had become a weapon of truth, cutting through lies, reshaping hearts, and changing the very psychology of the war. At the same time, U.S. officers used this success to strengthen morale among their own troops. Camp 47 became a symbol, a reminder that they were not fighting a war of conquest, but a war for civilization itself. One evening, during an officers' meeting, Colonel Harlan stood before his men and said, "Gentlemen, every time we choose mercy, we remind the world that freedom has a face, and it's ours." The room fell silent. Some of the younger soldiers who had seen too much death wiped their eyes quietly. They understood now that their uniforms didn't just represent power. They represented principle. And as word of Camp 47 spread, through reports, through whispers, through the very letters of men once sworn to die before surrender, something remarkable began to take shape: a reputation. The United States Army was no longer seen merely as a military giant. It was seen as a force of honor, justice, and humanity. And that reputation, born on a small Pacific island in 1944, would become one of America's greatest victories, a moral triumph that no enemy could erase. Because while others sought to conquer land, America sought to conquer the human heart. And in that mission it was succeeding. It was February 4, 1944, and the sea breeze carried the scent of salt and freedom through the camp. The sun hung low in the Pacific sky, and the American flag, worn by wind and weather, fluttered above the compound, a symbol of strength, fairness, and hope. The Japanese prisoners were lining up for morning assembly. What had once been a tense, wordless ritual had now become something else entirely. The guards no longer barked orders. The prisoners no longer looked at the ground. There was rhythm, respect, even quiet cooperation. Colonel James Harlan stood on the observation platform watching them. He could hardly believe the transformation. 2 months earlier, these men had been defiant, cold, and silent. Now they worked side by side with American soldiers, rebuilding fences, planting vegetables, even repairing damaged equipment. The war outside still raged, but inside these fences, another kind of victory was unfolding. Discipline through dignity, Harlan wrote in his journal that night. It's the American way. Each day new acts of trust began to appear. When an American truck broke down near the mess hall, 3 Japanese mechanics volunteered to help fix it. They worked tirelessly for hours, their hands covered in oil and sweat. When the engine finally roared to life, the men smiled shyly. Sergeant Bill Carter gave them a respectful nod and said, "Good work, fellas." They didn't understand the words fully, but they understood the tone. It was the tone of respect. That same week, a storm struck the island, fierce winds and heavy rain that battered the camp for 2 long days. Power went out. The guards were soaked to the bone and several tents collapsed. When the storm ended, something unexpected happened. The Japanese prisoners, without being told, began helping the Americans rebuild. They lifted poles, secured ropes, and carried supplies, shoulder to shoulder with the same men they once called enemies. No one ordered them to do it. They just did. Interesting fact. According to historical reports from the Pacific Theater, American-run POW camps consistently documented acts of voluntary cooperation by Japanese prisoners by early 1944, a phenomenon rarely seen in other nations' camps. Military historians later described this as a silent revolution of conscience, sparked by the humane treatment the POWs received from U.S. forces. By mid-February, Camp 47 had become more than a military installation. It was a living lesson in American values. Every evening, the guards and prisoners stood for the lowering of the flag. The Japanese men would stand quietly, watching the stars and stripes descend in the orange glow of the setting sun. At first they did so out of routine. But over time, something deeper began to stir within them: admiration. One of the POWs, Lieutenant Saito, who had been a schoolteacher in Tokyo before the war, approached Sergeant Carter after one of these ceremonies. In broken English he said, "Your flag, it means honor?" Carter nodded. "It means honor, freedom, and home," he said. Saito bowed deeply. "I understand now." Moments like that carried more weight than any victory on the battlefield. They were quiet, human victories, proof that America's true power wasn't in its guns or ships, but in its spirit. As weeks passed, the POWs began writing new kinds of letters home, letters that spoke of respect, gratitude, and even affection for their captors. "Americans are fair. They treat us not like dogs but like men," one wrote. "They have power but they do not abuse it. Perhaps this is why they are strong." Those letters, intercepted by Japanese intelligence, puzzled officers back in Tokyo. They didn't know whether to believe them. The idea that the enemy, the United States Army, could show compassion was unthinkable. But it was true. At Camp 47, the American soldiers continued to embody the ideals they had been raised on: discipline, decency, and duty. Even amid the horrors of war, they refused to lose their humanity. Colonel Harlan often reminded his men of that responsibility. During a camp assembly, he stood before his troops and said, "We fight with honor because that's what separates us from tyranny. The flag above us doesn't just represent victory, it represents virtue." The words struck deep. Even the Japanese translators hesitated for a moment, sensing their weight before relaying them. The prisoners listened in silence, their eyes fixed on the man speaking. An enemy, yes, but also a symbol of something greater, moral courage. That night, as the moon rose over the camp, soft voices carried through the quiet. The Japanese prisoners were singing, not a military song but an old folk tune about peace and home. Some of the American guards listened quietly from their posts, their faces calm and proud. Because they knew what was happening here was more than just reconciliation. It was redemption for both sides. And through it all, one truth became clear. Even in captivity, America's moral power was setting men free. The world would remember the U.S. Army's victories on land, at sea, and in the air. But for those who lived through Camp 47, the greatest victory was one of the heart. A victory born not of conquest, but of compassion. It was March 12, 1944. The winds off the Pacific were restless that morning, carrying with them the uneasy scent of storm clouds and something else, tension. Camp 47 had grown quiet. Too quiet. In the early hours before dawn, a small group of Japanese prisoners attempted something desperate. Word had spread that a transport ship might be nearby, and 3 men, led by a young corporal named Takeshi Mori, hatched a plan to escape. They didn't want to fight. They didn't even want revenge. They just wanted to go home. But what they didn't realize was that home no longer existed as they remembered it, and that the men guarding them were not their enemies but their protectors. When the escape attempt began, the camp sirens blared through the fog. Soldiers rushed to their posts. Colonel James Harlan threw on his jacket and strode into the chaos, calm as ever. "Keep your fire low," he ordered. "No killing unless necessary." Searchlights cut across the compound, sweeping over the dark silhouettes of the fleeing prisoners. But then, something incredible happened, something that would be talked about in military ethics classes for generations. Other Japanese prisoners, their fellow countrymen, ran toward the escapees, not away. They shouted warnings in Japanese, waving their arms, begging them to stop. One man, Lieutenant Saito, the same educated prisoner who once asked Sergeant Carter about the flag, stood directly in front of the fence, blocking their path. "Stop," he shouted. "No more dishonor. Americans have treated us like men." For a brief, breathless moment, time seemed to freeze. The guards watched, their fingers tense on their rifles as the prisoners argued in the moonlight. And then, the impossible happened. The escapees dropped their tools. Slowly, trembling, they surrendered. When the soldiers arrived, they didn't find defiance. They found remorse. Colonel Harlan, his voice steady but firm, ordered them taken back to the barracks. No one was harmed. No one punished beyond protocol. That night, the colonel called Saito to his office. "You didn't have to do that," Harlan said quietly. Saito bowed deeply. "Sir," he replied, "I did not do it for you. I did it because I have learned what honor truly means." For a long time Harlan said nothing. Then, in a rare gesture of respect, he extended his hand. And Saito shook it. Interesting fact. Official military records confirm that several Japanese POWs across Pacific camps in 1944 to 45 voluntarily prevented escape attempts or violent uprisings, choosing instead to maintain peace within the camps. Historians attribute this phenomenon to the consistent discipline, moral example, and humane treatment demonstrated by American officers. The event changed everything at Camp 47. In the days that followed, the prisoners took it upon themselves to reinforce the fences, rebuild the guard towers damaged during the commotion, and even write formal letters of apology to Colonel Harlan. The colonel didn't expect any of it, but he accepted their gesture with quiet pride. When Sergeant Bill Carter heard about Sato's act of courage, he simply said, "Guess that's what happens when men start believing in something better than hate." That line spread through the camp like a song. The American soldiers began to understand that their mission wasn't just to guard these men, it was to guide them. And for the Japanese prisoners, something profound had shifted forever. The very people they had been trained to despise were now the embodiment of everything they admired: strength, honor, mercy. By late March, the camp was a different world. The men worked side by side, laughed at small jokes, and shared quiet stories about home. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the barracks in gold, a group of POWs approached the American guards with a small handmade gift, a carved wooden plaque, etched with Japanese characters. It read, "To those who showed us humanity in war." Colonel Harlan placed it in his office beside the Stars and Stripes. That night, during the flag-lowering ceremony, something extraordinary happened once again. As the bugle played, the American soldiers stood at attention, and across from them, every Japanese prisoner bowed deeply in perfect silence. It wasn't an act of surrender. It was an act of respect. Because they had come to see that the American way, discipline, fairness, compassion, was not weakness. It was the highest form of strength. For the men of Camp 47, both sides had changed. The Americans had proven that victory was not only about winning wars but winning hearts. And the Japanese prisoners had shown that even in defeat, dignity could be reborn through truth. That night, as the Pacific waves whispered beyond the fence and the moon rose high, Colonel Harlan looked out over the camp and said softly to himself, This is what makes us different. We don't conquer to destroy. We conquer to rebuild. And with that, he turned and saluted the flag, the symbol of a nation that even in war never forgot its soul. It was August 15, 1945. The world had changed overnight. The Emperor of Japan had announced surrender, and the echoes of war that had thundered across the globe for nearly 6 years were finally fading. On a small island in the Pacific, far from the smoke of Tokyo and the cheers of Times Square, Camp 47 stood silent beneath a blazing sunrise. For months, the camp had been a place of quiet transformation. Now, it was about to become something else entirely, a symbol of what America stood for when the world lost its way. Colonel James Harlan stood on the platform that morning, the American flag rippling above him. Before him stood rows of men, American guards and Japanese prisoners alike, assembled together one last time. There were no weapons between them now. No barbed wire in their hearts. The announcement had come the night before. The war was over. The men would be going home. When the words reached the camp, the reaction was unlike anything anyone expected. The Americans cheered yes, but the Japanese prisoners, they wept. Some fell to their knees. Others simply stood in stunned silence. And then quietly something remarkable happened. They began to clap for their captors. The sound was soft at first, hesitant, but it grew, a rhythm of gratitude that filled the morning air. The guards looked around, unsure what to do. And then one of them, Sergeant Bill Carter, took off his cap and saluted the men who had once been his enemies. It was more than a salute. It was a gesture of respect, soldier to soldier, man to man. Colonel Harlan addressed them all, his voice steady and proud. Today, he said, the world remembers victory. But here we remember something greater. We remember that even in war we chose to be human. He paused, looking across the crowd. Your country will rebuild. Ours will return home. But never forget what you saw here, that strength without compassion is nothing. And compassion without strength cannot survive. Together they make us what we are, Americans. The interpreter hesitated as he translated, his voice breaking halfway through. But the message was clear. When Harlan finished, Lieutenant Saito, the prisoner who had once stood against his own men to prevent escape, stepped forward. His uniform was worn, his hands rough, but his eyes were filled with pride. He bowed deeply before the colonel and said in halting English, You showed us honor. You showed us freedom. We will never forget. He reached into his pocket and handed the colonel a small wooden figure, a hand-carved eagle, wings spread wide. For your flag, Saito said softly. Harlan accepted it, eyes glistening. And for yours, he replied. May you fly it again for peace. Interesting fact. After Japan's surrender, thousands of Japanese POWs held by the U.S. wrote testimonies describing humane treatment by American soldiers. Many of those men later became influential figures in post-war Japan's reconstruction. Educators, diplomats, even lawmakers, spreading ideals of democracy and respect they had first learned in American camps. As the prisoners boarded transport ships for repatriation, the American soldiers lined up along the pier. There were no shouts, no jeers, only silent salutes. Some of the Japanese men waved as they left, holding small American flags the guards had given them as parting gifts. One man shouted, Thank you, America, in broken English. The words echoed across the harbor, carried by the wind like a prayer. When the last boat disappeared beyond the horizon, Colonel Harlan stood at the water's edge, the carved eagle in his hand. Behind him, Sergeant Carter said quietly, Think they'll remember us, sir? Harlan looked out at the endless blue. They will, he said. Because we didn't just win the war. We won their hearts. And in that moment he knew, the legacy of Camp 47 wasn't written in medals or reports. It was written in the lives it changed. In a time when the world had been consumed by hate, This camp had proven that America's greatness came not from its might, but from its mercy. Years later, historians would write of battles won and nations rebuilt. But among the footnotes of history they would find this story, the story of a camp where American soldiers, against all odds, chose compassion over cruelty and decency over dominance. And they would understand that the true victory of World War II was not only on the beaches or in the skies, it was in the hearts of men who remembered what it meant to be free. As the screen fades to black, the words appear. Camp 47, where honor stood guard over humanity. And beneath it, the sound of a bugle plays, slow, proud, and eternal, the same tune that once echoed over a small island in 1944, when the United States Army showed the world that the mightiest weapon ever forged was the American heart.